promptly so that we can have a full evening. Our previous director of traffic was our enforcer, a dear friend and ally of the center's Michael Bardosi, and I'll be including him in my thanks in a few minutes. I will give a brief introduction and let you know what the mechanics for the evening are, and then I'll pass the floor to our speaker for this evening, whom we're all here to hear, of course. I'm very happy to welcome you. This is the second in our year-long series on the topic, Being Human, Human Being. My name is Barbara Altman. I have the honor of being the director of the Oregon Humanities Center, the sponsor of this event. We're a research center here at the U of O charged with the support of humanist research and teaching and with public programming on humanist themes for the larger community. We work actively to partner with community partners and with other institutions supporting the humanities. And I'd like to acknowledge our communication partner, the Oregon Humanities. Their name is almost identical to ours, so we have to try hard to keep each other distinct. They are formerly known as the Oregon State Council on the Humanities, and they help us get the word out about our programming in Portland and across the state. For Dr. Byock's visit in particular, we also had the pleasure of partnering with Peace Health Sacred Heart Medical Center at River Bend and their continuing medical education program. We began this year-long investigation of the human condition across the disciplines with a talk in November, which some of you might have attended, by civil rights activist and lawyer Michelle Alexander, who spoke on the new Jim Crow, mass incarceration in the age of colorblindness. That event drew a large crowd, the crowd that we thought would be the biggest of the year, but I think we might have surpassed that easily with this one, and so we're absolutely delighted to see you. What we wanted to do with this year's series on the human condition was to push the intersection, to find the intersection of the humanities with the life and social sciences. And all of that to demonstrate just how broadly and deeply the spirit of humanist inquiry can be found. We're a bit beyond the boundaries of humanities disciplines, but humanities for us is not the small h concept, the large H concept of the traditional departments. For us, it's the small h concept, the study of the human condition in its largest sense. One great aspect of this kind of an approach is that we're attracting all kinds of new audience members, and so I have a question for you. Who among you is at your first ever Oregon Humanities Center event? Would you raise your hand? That is truly wonderful news. Thank you for coming, and we're very pleased to have planned an event that brought you here. Should you wish to know more about our events, it's very easy to sign up for an electronic version or a hard copy of our newsletter. We have an information table in the lobby, and we'd be delighted to share with you what we have coming up. Okay, so with that in mind, that we're doing a very broad-ranging series this year, let me flag for you the other events that are coming up later in the year. Our next speaker will be Wade Davis, National Geographic Explorer in Residence and anthropologist. He'll be here on February 12th at 7:30, and his talk is titled The Wayfinders, Why Ancient Wisdom Matters in a Modern World. On March 5th at 7:30, we'll have David Eagleman, neuroscientist and director of the Laboratory for Perception and Action at Baylor College of Medicine, so you might wish to come back for that one. He'll give a talk related to his recent book, Incognito, The Secret Lives of the Brain. We'll end this year with Jonathan Haidt, who studies morality and emotion on May 29th, with a presentation on the righteous mind, why good people are divided by politics and religion. And Haidt will be taking to Portland as well, just as Dr. Byock will be speaking there tomorrow. But let's get back to tonight's lecture, which is really the anchor of our yearly series. If you're here tonight, you most likely know about Dr. Byock. He's a hard figure to miss these days. When he's not on the road, you might find him at the Dartmouth Hitchcock Medical Center in New Hampshire, where he is director of palliative medicine, as well as professor of anesthesiology and of community and family medicine at the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth College. A staunch and apparently tireless advocate for the rights of dying patients and their families, Byock headed toward the fields of hospice and palliative care after witnessing his father's battle with pancreatic cancer. He is now one of the leading proponents of compassionate end-of-life care in the United States, as it affects the individual, that person's family members, and the broader community. His first book, Dying Well, from 1997, has become a standard in the field. The second, Four Things That Matter Most, from 2004, is widely used as a counseling tool by palliative care and hospice programs. He co-authored Palliative and End-of-Life Pearls with John E. Hefner, and also A Few Months to Live, Different Paths to Life's End with Jana Staton and Roger Shui in 2001. His most recent book, The Best Care Possible, 2012, is subtitled A Physician's Quest to Transform Care Through the End of Life. It has been received with overwhelmingly positive praise from a very diverse set of reviewers, including medical practitioners, non-specialist readers, those in the caregiving community, and representatives of many different spiritual and religious practices. Of the many quotations I could read you, I'll limit myself to one short and concise choice. In the words of Roshi Joan Halifax from the Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, this is an extraordinary and wise book on how dying people can be cared for. Ira Byock, a master clinician and a man of great compassion, has a vision of healthcare that is brilliant and kind. It is those qualities that makes Dr. Byock the perfect choice for our Tzedek lectureship. He is our Tzedek lecturer for the year. The endowment for this lectureship was established in 1996 with a generous gift to the center. The title, Tzedek, is a reference to the Hebrew word for righteousness. And the lectureship is intended to bring someone who is both a thinker and a practitioner, a thinker and a doer, someone who makes personal ethical responsibility to others the focus of his or her work. You can see why we were so very happy when Dr. Byock accepted our invitation. One of the striking features of Dr. Byock's work is the number and kind of venues in which he talks about end-of-life issues. On this visit alone, as our lecturer, he also spoke this afternoon at Peace Health Riverbend Hospital in a presentation for members of the medical and palliative community, and he'll do the same early tomorrow at 2 different events at OHSU in Portland. He will have given several interviews before he leaves Portland, including Think Out Loud at the OPB studios tomorrow in Portland, and there was a piece on him in the Oregonian. Tomorrow evening, Dr. Byock will be speaking at the U of O in Portland at 7 p.m. in case any of you want to come up for another lecture tomorrow night. It'll be in the White Stag block downtown, and tomorrow's talk is titled The Best Care Possible Through the End of Life, What It Is, and How to Get It. Before this visit, you might have caught him on national TV and on radio programs, including NPR's Talk of the Nation, All Things Considered, and Fresh Air, or on CBS 60 Minutes, or ABC Nighttime, or the PBS The News Hour. Now, before I turn the mic over to our honored guest, let me give you an idea of what to expect tonight. Dr. Byock will speak for about an hour, and then he's agreed to take questions from the audience. If you'd like to ask a question, please come to one of the mics in the aisles, and if you can't or prefer not to come to the mic, we'll be happy to bring a portable mic to you. The reason we ask you to speak into the mic is because we're live streaming this talk, and so that will make sure that our audience at home watching it on their computers will be able to hear your question. We also have an overflow room, so the people in the other room will want to be able to hear the questions as well. We know, because this is a topic about which people care deeply and passionately, we anticipate that there will be many people interested in engaging with Dr. Byock in the question and answer session. If you choose to do so, please keep in mind your fellow audience members. Come to the mic with a question rather than a statement, if you would. Please keep your questions short so we can accommodate as many people as possible. And I thank you in advance for keeping the exchange respectful and courteous. After the question and answer, we'll have a book sale and signing. The books are for sale in the lobby outside this room, and the signing will be here at this table to your left of the podium. That helps the traffic flow to have those two things happen in different places. Just before we turn over the mic, I want to thank my colleagues at the Oregon Humanities Center. It takes a whole team to organize an event like this. And while I'm the spokesperson for the center, I'm hardly responsible for more than a little piece of it. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Julia Hayden, who is even now stepping the door, our associate director, and the linchpin for everything we do, including tracking down first-rate speakers like Dr. Byock and working out myriad details so that they actually make it to Eugene. Melissa Gustafson, program and events coordinator, who takes care of all things practical. Peg Gearhart, our designer and communications person, who's designing our truly striking posters and newsletters. So we owe to Peg those very compelling images. And she's also the producer of our TV show. Tonight we have working with us Eden Demacy, our work study student who intrepidly jumped into this first event with us after just a few days with us. And we have Michael Bardossi helping out as well, longtime ally of the center. So now let's move on to what you've been waiting for. For this talk, Mortality, Morality, and the Meaning of Life, please help me welcome Dr. Ira Byock.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you, Barb, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for being here. I can't tell you how pleased and privileged it feels to be the Tzedek lecturer this year. I'll try it for another moment or two and then give up. I can't tell you how pleased and privileged I feel to be a Tzedek lecturer this year. It really is wonderful to be here, to be back in Eugene. I've been here a number of times, and Yvonne, my wife Yvonne, is with me. Say hello, Yvonne, please. We live in the great state of New Hampshire, but we went there from Missoula, Montana, and we are sort of once and future Missoulians. So we are very familiar with this part of the country and are frankly really delighted to be here. Let's see, I'm going to try to move. Excuse me. I was given the charge tonight to sort of stretch people's minds about this topic that so many of you feel passionate about, and that's what binds us. To think more deeply about the role of mortality and death in our lives. And you think that's going to work? And to we're going to define. I'm okay. I'm okay over here, though.
Well,
as long as this doesn't fall.
Check 1, 2.
We're going to be fine. No, this is great. It's something that so often we're talking, I talk to clinical audiences and we're talking about the practicalities and the pharmacology and the protocols for treating people's discomforts and making the best of their quality of life. I talked today at Peace Health about how to make informed decisions and shared decision making and the role of palliative care. I'll glance at that, but really tonight we're really looking at the role of mortality in the human condition. I'm not going to be talking about policy. This is not a political talk. It is a talk grounded in ethics and in humanities as appropriate. So let's get to it, because I've got a lot to say, and night's getting later. It may seem that it's a little impertinent for a physician to be addressing issues of the meaning of life in the context of mortality. I want you to know I do this with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek. I don't really know. But I know a bit about it. The preciousness of life underlies all of medicine. It always has. Indeed, all of the caring professions. Preserving life is a paramount motivation and clinical goal. Mortality is the enemy to be conquered. And when it occurs, when somebody dies, it feels like failure, defeat. The essential nature and of life entails meaning and purpose, or purpose and making order from disorder. That's what life does, even on a cellular level. Phenomenologically, death is non-being, the antithesis of life. And despite its stillness, death represents a sort of chaos. I cannot know anything with certainty about death. I must accept that death itself may or may not be meaningless. Nevertheless, it is apparent that the fact of death profoundly impacts our understanding and experience of meaning in life. Death is the backdrop against which all life takes place. Its relationship to life is as profound as the relationship of darkness to light. Death provides that backdrop for all of us. From this perspective, both clinically and philosophically, the question, what is the meaning of death, becomes relevant and maybe approachable. Inquiry into the meaning or the value of death in human life can be approached from cultural, individual, communal, and clinical perspectives. And we're going to do it all. If death represents ultimate ego annihilation, it is no wonder that people have an aversion to actually thinking and talking about it. 17th century French writer and moralist La Rochefoucauld observed, "One can no more look steadily at death than at the sun." Contemplating non-being is a Gordian knot. Attempting to understand death is inherently frustrating and can provoke considerable anxiety. Many of our leading philosophers and thinkers, and theorists, including Freud, Sigmund Freud, Ernst Becker, prominently among them, consider death to be the source of all human anxiety. It's interesting that it is death and not merely non-being that seems most anxiety-provoking. For most people, it is equally frustrating, though far less anxiety-provoking, to contemplate one's non-existence before conception and birth than after death. So it may be that it's actually the loss of having been that we dread so much. The human capacity, in fact, to conceptualize time and therefore to conceptualize a future where one might not be present underlies the meaning of death. One can only speculate about other species' understanding and orientation toward death. Ethological observations reveal that animals flee from perceived threats to life instinctively, although these instincts may be overridden in certain circumstances, like protecting one's young. While lower animals may not be able to conceptualize the meaning of death, it seems that we human beings have no choice but to try. If I had time, I'd go through some of the neurological studies that have shown that we're inherently meaning makers. We're driven toward meaning. Even when given different parts of our brain are given disparate images, we tend to make stories that connect them. We have a drive toward meaning. And that seems particularly when a problem cannot be solved, like the impact of death on our lives. Awareness of death confronts us with questions that go to the very nature of human existence. What's the nature of life? Is there a continued existence beyond life or this life? Does life have any meaning? What's the meaning of my own life? These questions, asked in an infinite variety of ways, are part of the human confrontation with death. Such questions define our place in the world and our relationship to one another. They hold profound relevance to how we live, both as individuals and collectively as families, communities, nations, societies. A culture's orientation to these questions underpin a culture's moral values and ethical norms of behavior. Although inquiry of this nature may seem familiar to philosophers and theologians, most people actively avoid the subject of death. However, even for the least introspective among us, the ever-present fact of mortality constantly threatens to awake us from this dream of life. From the moment an individual is diagnosed with an incurable illness, death becomes the alarm that won't stop ringing. We can hide from it, we can keep ourselves busy, we can drug ourselves with alcohol or other chemicals, but this distant ring can be heard. It's even heard during periods of relative stability when people are in remission or their heart failure or kidney failure or liver failure is quiescent. The intrusion of a life-threatening diagnosis forces us to look at things we most want to avoid. Hitherto philosophical questions and issues that seemed abstract and avoidable suddenly have immediacy in our lives. Existential concepts like the aloneness of the individual in the universe become all too real when one is faced with approaching the inevitable loss of everyone we know and love, or once loved. The person living with progressive illness directly experiences the profound implications of the issues of meaning that impact the way we live, individually and collectively. Our cultural and individual orientations to death are intimately interwoven. At any point in time, all of us are at once a product of our culture and a participant in its ongoing evolution. It is well recognized that denial, or perhaps more accurately, suppression, are psychological defense mechanisms that mark our Western orientation toward death. You know, too old? Yeah, right? We buy health club memberships. We buy Bowflex machines. We buy Nordic tracks. I actually know people who use them. Not many, but some. We jog and we swim and we bicycle long distances. We check our breasts and our testicles for lumps. We know our cholesterol numbers. We know exactly how much fat we eat every day in our diets and exactly what kinds of fat we eat. We eat fiber until flatulence threatens us with social embarrassment and stresses our spousal relationships. But until illness strikes, we don't want to talk about or think about any of this stuff. We act as if we're going to live forever. This is from Missoula, Montana. Maybe this is the last year I'm going hunting. I swear I've taken care of this guy. So, you know, if avoidance of death is so deeply rooted in our individual and cultural psyches, it may be presumed that a world without death would be a utopia. Robert Kastenbaum has actually brought some empiric data to this question. A simple but intriguing experiment that suggests, well, maybe not. In a two-phased written survey, he involved 214, of course, university students, who were enrolled in a lecture course on death-related topics. He asked them to concisely express their feelings about living in a world without aging and death. The assignment was given prior to any of the readings that he assigned or classwork. Initially, the responses shown here, 88% were clearly positive. Typical written comments were, "You bet, does it start now?" And "I love it, this makes my day." Students were then given a written homework assignment and specific instructions to consider and list. A, the effects of a world without death would have on other people and society in general. B, the effects a world without death would have on the way you live and experience your own life. And then the initial question was repeated. The survey results changed dramatically. 88% now were negative and thought it wasn't such a good idea, and only 18% were positive. 82% were negative. Expressed concerns about the absence of death on society clustered around things like issues of overcrowding, mandatory birth control, loss of rules governing human relationships, the conservative influence of massive numbers of elderly, and the potential of economic systems to falter. One quote, "Kids wouldn't get their inheritance," one said. And the erosion of religious beliefs. Worrisome impacts of individuals' on individuals' lives included loss of ambition, loss of meaning, interesting, loss of heaven, and less need to be responsible. Under the category loss of meaning, Kastenbaum reports that the following quotes as being somewhat characteristic. "I cannot think of myself going on and things not coming to an end. I'd have to ask myself, what is life all about? And I don't know what if I can answer that question. I have a real hard time imagining what it would be like to live in this kind of a world. To be honest, I don't know what life would mean to me if I knew I was going to go on and on." Now, of course, the implications of a thought experiment of this nature are limited. 214 university students who elect to take a course on death and dying do not constitute a representative sample of the human population. Still, the consistency and the dramatic reversal of responses warrants consideration. Perhaps, as theologians and philosophers and poets have long thought, life without death would be so monotonous and so devoid of intensity and pathos and joy as to render the human condition nearly meaningless. Indeed, it is not necessary to say that death gives life meaning, to note that death may be necessary for life to have meaning. So let's look at the personal confrontation with death. As inherently problematic and difficult as it is, the nature of dying needs to be understood in order to have a conversation about how to approach caring well for people. The fundamental nature of illness and dying is only partly medical. We doctors are taught, I am complicit because as medical faculty, I know at one of the best medical schools in the country, we're teaching young medical students to think about and approach dying people as a set of medical problems to be solved. That's the way the medical zeitgeist is a problem-based model. You come to the doctor with problems. We create problem lists on every problem. The problem list on a chart is the table of contents on a chart. For every problem on a list, we soap our notes. Some of you who are medical students or clinical will know. You create subjective information from the interview, objective information from an exam, and vital signs and tests, an assessment and a plan. That's how we approach people through a problem-based model. But the fundamental nature of illness and dying is only partly medical. It is mostly and most profoundly personal for the individual and family. Until one understands that, certainly physicians, they are not going to get this right. They will continue to act in medical ways for something that is only partly medical. And I say this because the general culture has absorbed the medical approach and thinks about illness and dying solely through the lens of medicine, and it distorts what we see. Let me give you some information. Rich empiric evidence from biographical and medical literature have established that an individual's confrontation with death is personal and therefore has the capacity for suffering as well as the capacity for some opportunities of value to the individual personally. In an essay written about a year after he was given the diagnosis of incurable esophageal cancer, this gentleman, Dr. Bill Bartholomew, who was a friend and a pediatrician and medical ethicist at the University of Kansas Medical Center, he was given this diagnosis, told he had probably a year or less to live. Thankfully, he actually lived over 5 years, and thankfully he was writing during this time. He wrote the following essay, and I've pieced together 3 significant pieces of it from about a 1,200-word essay he wrote and published in the University of Kansas Medical Center Bulletin. I'm going to quote from it. It's been a little over a year now since I discovered that I have a fatal disease. In trying to explain to family and friends what having this period of time has meant to me, I have found it helpful to characterize it as a gift. It has allowed me time to prepare my family for a future in which I will not be physically present to them. It has given me the opportunity of tying up all the loose ends that our lives all have. I've been provided the opportunity of reconnecting with those who have taught me, who have shared their lives with me, who have touched my life. I've been able to reconnect with those from whom I had been estranged over the years, to apologize for past wrongs, to seek forgiveness for past failings. But even more than all of these, this gift has provided me the opportunity of discovering what it is like to live in the light of death, to live with death sitting on my shoulder. It has had a powerful effect on me, my perspective on the world, and my priorities. I like the person I am becoming more than I've ever liked myself before. There's a kind of spontaneity and joyfulness in my life that I have rarely known before. I am finally free of the tyranny of all the things that need to get done. I realize more than I ever have before that I exist in a web of relationships that support and nourish me, that clinging to each other here against the dark beyond is what makes us human. I have come to know more about what it means to receive and to give love unconditionally. He says, he closes, to live in the bright light of death is to live a life in which colors and sounds and smells are all more intense, in which smiles and laughs are irresistibly infectious, in which touches and hugs are warm and tender, almost beyond belief. And he closes, I wish that the final chapter in all of your stories can be one in which you are given the gift of some time to live with your fatal illness. Now that's a different mindset. In fact, when you understand that the nature of dying is inherently personal and only partly medical, it becomes less mystical or less woo-woo to understand that, I know I'm in Eugene, so that's not a bad word. So it becomes understandable that concomitant with the unwanted, difficult, unromantic, often tragic, always sad experience of serious illness and impending death, there are also opportunities that people value, that they've told me for years that they value. Opportunities to share the bad news with those that one loves, to express sad feelings together, to share the pain together. An opportunity to complete one's affairs, the things that would be left incomplete if you were to die suddenly, as any of us might. A chance to get one's business affairs and legal affairs in order, to turn over projects that aren't finished, or to finish those that you want to come to resolution. But also a chance to complete relationships, to say the things that would be left unsaid between people you love or people you once loved. The please forgive me's, I forgive you's, thank you's, I love you's. Those are important stuff that people have told me they often value. Not everyone, but far more than 50% of people say, yes, that would matter. A chance to resolve previously strained relationships, perhaps between a father and son who haven't spoken in years, or previous spouses who were married for 20 years but have now been divorced after a painful divorce 17 or 18 years ago, when one or the other is seriously ill. Not always, but pretty often it matters that they get back in touch. Sometimes standing in front of the monolith of our mortality makes the transgressions and the anger that have separated us look small compared to the bonds that unite us. A chance to review one's life, to tell one's stories, and through the recording or telling of stories, perhaps to pass on a legacy, a unique legacy that no one else on the planet could give to a family to be passed on. A chance to connect to those realms of meaning and purpose that are part and parcel of the human condition. Indeed, the response of an individual's confrontation with death arises from questions that define existential and spiritual realms of life. I mentioned them before. Who am I? What is life? Who or what was I and where was I before I was born? Where will I exist after I die? Forced to live with the knowledge of impending death, such questions suddenly assume poignant relevance. Some people experience severe spiritual or existential distress, while others develop a seemingly paradoxical sense of rightness and well-being that involves some realm of their inner lives. Accounts of positive subjective experiences with the end of life document a transition through spiritual or existential distress toward a sense of well-being. That's a rich literature that I think has clinical relevance, by the way. Recognition of these poles of human experience engendered by death's approach, from severe distress on the one hand to a sense of well-being on the other, demonstrate the potential for at least some individuals to move through suffering, making it imperative for clinicians who care for dying people to understand something about this realm of human experience. The inherent mystery of existence is at once awe-inspiring and utterly terrifying. In responding to that mystery, some people seek to discover some meaning within their own lives. Listening for one or more of these themes have been helpful to me in counseling people. Religion is one of the principal ways that people tend to try to make meaning, but it's certainly not the only one. But religion is one way that we have reached out collectively to one another within community and across generations in dealing with some of these profound questions of life, including the confrontation with death. Religion, of course, refers to a coherent set of beliefs and values and eschatology and knowledge and techniques and rituals and customs all around fostering a sense of meaning and connection in dealing with the mystery, the awe-inspiring and terrifying mystery of existence. Religion often involves a sense of deity or belief in deity, but it's not necessary for something to be, for a body of beliefs and practices to constitute a religion. Indeed, inherently, though, that confrontation with death evokes the spiritual nature, goes to the spiritual core of the human condition. I asked a gruff, elderly Vermont farmer, I'll call him Mr. Grady. This is not his picture, but he looks a little like this. I saw him in clinic, and I asked him, he had cancer, and I asked him, as I ask every patient I am getting to know, do you consider yourself a spiritual person? It's not the first thing I ask, but in the midst of the evaluation, do you consider yourself a spiritual person? It's my way of doing a spiritual screen. Mr. Grady said, not me, doc. I said, well, do you have a sense of where we go after we leave this life? He said, yep, worms go in, the worms go out. I was half expecting the response, and so, I followed up. I said, and Mr. Grady, where will the worms go in and out of your bones? He said, oh, doc, we have a place, a plot on our farm up in Thetford, and we Grady's have been buried there for years. I have century ancestors there, and I'll be there, and my children, and probably their children will be there too. It's so interesting because Mr. Grady doesn't believe in God, have a religion, go to church or pray, but he has a visceral sense of connection to a family which preceded him for generations and will follow him into an open-ended future, and a sense of connection to that family and to the land. If that's not spiritual, I'm not sure what to call it. Very interesting. Oops. Uh-oh. But we tend to try to make meaning. This is a little embarrassing to admit, he says, but everything that happens for no reason. Existentialists see the universe as cold and impersonal, leaving each individual exposed to happenstance and circumstance, ultimately reliant on his or her self. That's all you got. It might be presumed that existentialism and spirituality are polar opposites, mutually exclusive. In fact, maybe not. This is Alice, not her real name. It's not even a real picture, but a real person. I can't make this stuff up. Weekends are quieter at the hospital, and Alice was somebody I met. We were following at Dartmouth-Hitchcock. I was on rounds on a Sunday, and on this particular Sunday, it was reasonably quiet, and my rounds mostly comprised going to room to see the people who I was following, and sort of visiting. And in each room, instead of talking about death, we ended up talking about life. Alice was a 47-year-old woman with advanced intraperitoneal carcinoma, something like ovarian cancer, and ascites, swelling of her abdomen with fluid, who was admitted the previous week when her left leg suddenly went cold and blue. After a successful removal of a clot that had impeded her circulation, she was better, but she developed kidney failure. When I visited in her room that day, following the requisite discussion about how her pains are and how she slept and how her appetite is and how her bowels, we ended up talking about poems. She had a collection of poems by her bedside, and I talked about that, and we read a few. There were Rumi poems, and then I shared with her a favorite poem, and I asked her to guess who had wrote it. Quote, "You do not need to leave your room. Remain sitting at your table and listen. Do not even listen. Simply wait. Do not even wait. Be quiet, still and solitary. The world will freely offer itself to you to be unmasked. It has no choice. It will roll in ecstasy at your feet." Alice correctly surmised that it wasn't Rumi, whose poems we were reading, but was surprised to learn that the poet was actually Franz Kafka, the quintessential existentialist. Kafka realized and recognized an aesthetic intelligence within the very stuff of reality. This led Alice and I to talk about chaos theory and fractals and patterns within randomness and that of God within us all and all that is. Somehow, in the context of her hospital room and her precarious condition, Anne surprisingly found a sense of well-being and peace in the face of loss. Kafka's vision has actually been confirmed by science. Note, this isn't a painting. This is a photo from the Hubble spacecraft. It carries important implications for spiritual aspects of people's life and development, including the development of human communities. Because even if there is no master plan, the intricacies of patterns and laws of physics and astrophysics and quantum mechanics and molecular biology suggest indeed a subtle aesthetic intelligence within the very stuff, within the very fabric of the physical reality. Approached from the most coldly rational perspective, one cannot escape the implications of death on the meaning of life as individuals, and more particularly, life in relationship to others. Earth is but a speck of rock hurtling through deep space. The circumference of the Earth, folks, is 24,901 miles at its widest point. I have 2 cars that have 6 times that amount of miles. Many people drive that number of miles every year. This is a small place. All of us are but tiny creatures living precariously on the surface of this little rock hurtling through the deep space, held on the surface by something called gravity, which nobody has well explained to me yet, and protected from the Milky Way's frigid ravages by a thin layer of air. Now, whether or not there is an active, watchful deity, human beings, I believe, are still faced with the reality of living on this earth. And the question that seems to confront us collectively is, how then shall we live? So what is the morality? How does mortality, inform the morality of our communities? Indeed, individuals do not live in isolation. We are human. As human beings, we are social animals. In common with most mammals, that's the very nature of our existence. We don't do well even physically in isolation. We are inherently connected. Even the strictest of hermits depends on others for certain necessities. Food, clothing, shelter from the elements usually, but at very least emergency services at times, or protection from others who might prey upon them. Indeed, humanness may have no meaning outside of our connection to one another. And that exists for other primates as well. Renee Spitz's famous studies into the hospitalism or the pediatric failure to thrive syndrome, in which as recently as the late 1930s, babies were dying in droves in foundling homes, public orphanages run by nuns usually, not because they weren't well fed or well cleansed, but because they were fed and cleansed and then swaddled and not touched until it was time for them to be touched again. And Spitz and associates, through some remarkably inventive experiments, proved that although these children were usually dying of measles or infectious diseases, that wasn't the reason, and nobody really believed that was the reason, that there was something, they had immune system collapse that was related to the failure of human touch. And that's what we fixed, and the syndrome went away. This was built on the work of Harlow. You know Harlow's monkeys, where he substituted surrogate mothers, and the monkeys would thrive, but without the surrogate mothers, they would wither and die. Indeed, this is part of well-being. We are connected to one another. It's not just nice emotions. It is physically part of our condition. Bill Bartholomew's observation, he said, clinging to each other here against the dark beyond is what makes us human, may be literally true. It may not just be our 46 chromosomes and our opposable thumbs that make us human, but the way we are with one another in community. In fact, Professor Harold Vanderpool, in an article in JAMA, Journal of American Medical Association, entitled The Ethics of Terminal Care, said it quite plainly. Being part of a community is essential for the development of consciousness and individuality and is characterized by communication, mutuality, and the ethical ideals of fidelity, gratitude, reciprocity, justice, and love. This is who we are. Anthropologist Margaret Mead was once asked what she considered to be the earliest evidence of civilization. She answered quickly that it was a human thigh bone, a femur, with a healed fracture that had been excavated from a 15,000-year-old site. For an early human to have survived a broken femur, living through months required for this bone to heal, meant that that person had to have been cared for, sheltered, protected, and brought food and drink by somebody else. While other animals care for their young and injured just like we do, no other species is able to devote as much time and energy in caring for the most frail, ill, and dying of its members. Vanderpool in his article said, these four fundamental features of human worth, respect for the individual, inclusion in community, concern for the body, and considerations of a broader purpose are offered as ethical guidelines for terminal care. So the question then becomes, what services should communities and society as a whole extend to people who are dying? How and how much should individuals and families pay for such services? Are there certain services that are so basic that they must be available to all? Should others services be based solely on one's ability to pay and be discretionary? What responsibilities do we have to people who are dying? Our family members, our friends, our neighbors, and those who we do not know, unbefriended people. What responsibilities do we have individually and collectively as a society? For if society has any responsibility, it probably can be reduced to at least to the responsibility to care. Now, if you look up care in the dictionary, you find that the verb has definitions such as to take charge of, to look after, to provide for. Notice that in its very definition, there is this sense of continuation. There's an open-ended nature to take care of, to take charge of, to provide for. By its very nature, it's longitudinal. And we care for one another as part of a covenant, if you will, certainly in families. The most essential nature of human caring through the end of life can be boiled down, when you actually turn attention to it in that stark way, to several essential components. Shelter from the elements. We say to the other person, we will keep you warm, we will keep you dry. Provision of hygiene. We say to the other person, we will keep you clean. Assistance with elimination. We will help you with your bowels and your bladder function. The offering of food and drink. We will always offer you something to eat and drink, and we will help you to do so. The keeping of company, non-abandonment. We say to the other person, we will be with you. You will not have to go through this time entirely alone. And efforts to alleviate symptoms and suffering. We say to the other person, we will do whatever we can with as much skill and expertise as we can bring to bear to lessen your discomfort. As a modern society, and certainly as healthcare professionals, we possess abundant resources and capacity for alleviating suffering. But notice that that's really the only one that requires prescriptive authority, a license, and reimbursement of the sort that doctors get. Indeed, if we have a deficiency today, and we do, it seems to be in our commitment to deliver care to those who are facing the end of life. In our society, at this time in contemporary world, alleviation of physical suffering among people who are dying is always possible, if our commitment is strong. But the basic things seem as important. Hygiene, bowel and bladder function, oral care, holding, turning, mopping of brows, provision of fluids, tea and broth, the keeping of company, perhaps in silence, perhaps with the gentle singing of lullabies. These fundamental components of care define a bottom line of non-negotiable elements that I believe as a human civilization and society we must not sink below. Whether or not society acknowledges a responsibility to provide organ transplantation or experimental chemotherapies or even physician-assisted suicide, We can acknowledge a social responsibility to provide these basic elements of human caring and honor the inalienable human right to die accompanied, in relative comfort, and in a clean, dry bed. My favorite Jewish ethicist, feminist ethicist, Lori Zoloth, said, "Cleaving to another, recognizing that the other is the bone of the bone and the flesh of the flesh that is given in common, locating the mutual body as the site of the moral gesture is fundamental to ethical reflection. It requires a radical rethinking of all that occurs to the other. All of the yearning, all of the loss is in fact my loss." She says this responsibility for the narratives, great and small, for the dreams of the other, for the temptations of the other, for the responsibility of the other, creates a mutual commandedness. The encounter is intensely personal. The death of the other, the illness of the other, her vulnerability is your own. Martin Buber quoted Rabbi Pincus, a historic figure, who said, "When one is singing and cannot lift up his voice, and another comes who can lift up his voice, then the first will be able to lift his voice too. That is the secret of the bond between spirit and spirit." And back to Lori. That each of us will die is inevitable. What must come to be understood as miraculous is our ability to love and bear the weight of the dying in fellowship. What she's describing is a covenantal relationship within community. The vision she offers is one in which people are born into the welcoming arms of community and die from the reluctant arms of community. That can inform clinical practice. Indeed, the origin and the role of practice, you have to look in the long humanitarian, through the humanities, the long arc of history. People have always cared for one another since the earliest of times. It's an impulse. Caring is embedded in our genetic code. We cannot do otherwise. We have a drive to do it, and if we don't do it, we suffer the lack of it. Earliest responses were instinctive, practical, communal. Caring was always motivated by something one can fairly call love. Love was the initial impetus and remains a driving force in the clinical professions today. It's not talked about very much, except with sort of nods and winks to one another, clinicians. But we know it's there. It's there. Family and communal responses matured, and eventually the caring professions came about. Gradually, of course, things got more sophisticated. We brought a scientific method to this. And within the 19th century, really, you start to see medical and surgical care improve. During the 1930s to the 1950s, the pace of progress quickened rapidly with the advent of antibiotics and general surgery and good anesthesia. People started coming back from the hospital with things that would have killed them just a few years earlier. In the 1960s through 1990s, cardiac care, emergency services, surgical trauma, further advances in surgery, I could go on and on. Medical miracles really started to happen. Transplantation medicine started to happen. Then the really, really best care seemed to be getting your loved one into an ICU. Instead of distributing collective ownership of these basic obligations and discharging them in a proportionate fashion, society began to assign sole responsibility for care for people who are dying to the clinical professions. The conscious motivation was to give the best care, of course. However, it's also true that by professionalizing care for people who are facing the end of life, we help distance them from us. Right? We talk nowadays about care for the dying, as if they're not you and me. Right? It's a way to do it. We put them in nursing homes, partly to give them care, but partly to keep them out of our sight. At least it serves a purpose of reinforcing that we're not there yet. If somebody dies in a car accident, what's the first question that gets asked often?
Did they suffer?
Were they wearing a seatbelt? Really? Really? Were they drunk? Were they wearing a seatbelt? Because that's not me, because I wear my seatbelt. If somebody dies of cancer, he was a smoker, wasn't he? Because, it's really interesting. We get to the suffering, though, too, but we want to know if we're still at risk for that. Oh, there was a family history of cancer, I'll bet. Something to say it's not me. Now, even today, medical training remains, of course, focused on disease. We have a disease treatment system, not a healthcare system. And there's a shamanistic aspect that society has attributed to doctors, right? As defenders of death. We battle against death. The selection process at all stages for medical training has to do with warrior traits. Medical training is concentrated in hospitals, which in our secular society symbolizes temples of death denial. And deep within those temples, the ICUs and the ORs are surely the sanctum sanctorum of death denial. There, the most highly trained of doctors and technically sophisticated nurses speak to one another in esoteric languages. We wear specialized garb and perform complex rituals to ward off unseen forces that threaten the lives of those who come to us for care. In these places, an unrelenting opposition toward death is modeled and rewarded. Medical students, interns, and residents learn early on that straight talk about death is interpreted as weakness or laziness, equated with a student giving up, not having the wherewithal to figure out, to research what to do next. Now, hospice began in the mid-60s and 1970s as a countercultural response to all of this. It didn't start within medicine, it started outside of medicine. You know, it was a countercultural social response led, by the way, mostly by nurses against the phenomenon of people dying badly, mostly in hospitals, often in pain, too often alone. In the early 80s, while I was attending an emergency medicine conference, I used to practice emergency medicine, I mentioned to an evening reception where we're having drinks and looking at poster presentations and stuff, I mentioned in passing to a group of physician colleagues that I had met that I worked part-time as a medical director for a local hospice program. One of the group actually physically looked disturbed and took a step back and said with a sour expression, "Why would a doctor do that?" He clearly conveyed his distaste for it seemed unseemly to him that one would do that. Of course, over the past 30 or so years, we've come a long way. Now, hospice and palliative medicine is a formal subspecialty. We've re-entered or we've been grafted onto the corpus of established medicine. So now we're asking another layer of questions about the value of care and the value of this time of life. It's become proper for doctors to have these conversations. Of course, we're still carrying more than our share of proportionate care for people through the end of life for the part of society. Naturally, the criticisms that doctors and the medical profession get for deficiencies of care are warranted, and we need to vastly, even today, vastly improve medical training and education and standards of care. It's not trivial. But if all we do is improve medical care for people who are dying, the best we will achieve is a better medicalized end-of-life experience. And that's not going to feel like success to any of us. On behalf of society, clinicians can commit to doing better, whatever is necessary to alleviate distress, but also clear communication and continuity of care and decision-making. That, at least, we can and must do. In my talk today at Peace Health, and a talk that I often engage in with medical students in their third year, I ask, are there limits to the doctor's role? It's a talk called, what are doctors for? Now, here's where things get challenging, because we don't teach boundaries, professional boundaries to medical students very well. We medical educators do a lousy job of it. They think that they have to be somehow distanced emotionally from patients. So if they have feelings, become sad, or have warm friendships, that's somehow crossing a line. I teach medical students that there are only really 3 main prohibitions that you need to get clear about, after which you can relax and bring your whole self to the clinical encounter. You don't have to be distanced from patients. You can really be authentic with patients. But from the very beginnings of the medical profession, society, in return for granting doctors authority and privileges that nobody else in society is given, privilege is to touch people in intimate ways, to talk with them about highly personal matters that would otherwise be inappropriate conversations to have. Society, and to compensate them well for their professional services. Society imposed clear limitations on a doctor's role. Specific provisions were put in place for the profession and embraced by the medical profession now throughout history in order to protect vulnerable people from the power that this profession has. I teach medical students that there are 3 basic things we must not do. One is no personal gain. This is always about service to the patient. We cannot charge a patient other than established charges, legitimate charges for professional services. And we cannot, end up taking more from them. Doctors without boundaries. The doctor is asking, so could we have all of your stuff after you die? We would never do that. We have development offices to do that. And I know, and some of you may know, that I've known colleagues who ended up in patients' wills for sizable amounts of money or property. It's not okay. We gave that up. You gave that up when you took the oath and decided to be a doctor. Second, no sex, not okay. Even if the patient initiates it. Oh, doctor, you feel it too. I know nobody else understands me. I know you feel it. Not okay. Remember this guy, Gabriel Byrne, played psychoanalyst Paul Weston in the HBO series In Treatment. He has his Monday 9 a.m. patient, Laura, falls in love with him, and he feels it too. She's the one who presses the relationship, but he crosses the line and says yes, and they have an affair. Not okay. People say, but Dr. Byock, I have friends who are a couple, they have 3 kids, they've been married for 25 years. It started as a professional relationship between doctor and patient. It's not my role to judge, but it's not okay, and the exception does not disprove the principle. It's an unequal power relationship. People have to be able to feel vulnerable, and even if they're totally naked and we're probing their bodies with our fingers or instruments, we gave up the opportunity to have intimate personal relationships of that nature. It is not okay. And lastly, no killing. Sorry, I know it's legal in Oregon, and I have friends from the Compassion and Choices here, but from an ethical, historical perspective, doctors are not supposed to kill patients. This comes from, back in antiquity. We think of it as being from the tabrets of Moses, but it's actually was embedded within secular ethics, society ethics. Society has always been life-affirming, protective of life. And the medical profession is part of that. We are not supposed to intentionally kill patients. Enough people die unintentionally. This is important these days because the public is confused about hospice and palliative care and assisted suicide. Remind me, he says, which is it we're interested in, assisted living or assisted suicide? It's a problem. I make fun of it, but only because it's so serious. Recently, I did a week on service. I'm frequently taking care of patients. On another weekend, 2 of the patients I saw needed to sit down and talk to me about how what I was doing was different from Jack Kevorkian or euthanasia before they would allow I and our team to take care of their loved one. This is a serious issue. In fact, you can find my name and other leaders of the palliative care community, if you will, or movement, pilloried by certain fringe social conservatives who, for their own political motives, want to conflate what we do, indeed, with euthanasia. And they're raising money for their, organizations by fomenting what really is not true at all. We are all about life. We are the most pro-life movement of American society, I think. Got nothing to do with abortion. But in order to really affirm life, one has to affirm all of life, and that includes the times we call serious illness, dying, death, and grief. We can alleviate suffering, and there are really minimal limits to my ability to use medicines and other other modalities to alleviate suffering when somebody is dying. But that's different than alleviating the sufferer. Hastening death is different than allowing somebody to die, which is what I do all the time. People say, well, what do you think about aid in dying? I aid people in their dying day in and day out. It's important to note that suffering is not trivial. One of my mentors, one of the real founders of palliative medicine, said this years ago. A doctor who has never been tempted to kill a patient probably has had limited clinical experience or is not able to empathize with those who suffer. I have to tell you in all honesty, at least once or twice a month, I meet a patient who in my heart of hearts I think would have been better off had they died last week. I meet patients who I think would be better off if they died later today. But that's indeed why we have principles and standards, and that's why we work in teams. Because there are times when a doctor cannot imagine what else he or she could do to address the suffering of a person. And it may be that the capacity to address that suffering is not absolute, but the doctor cannot imagine it. Maybe the limitation is in his or her imagination. Maybe they've never been trained in this particular set of symptoms or symptom cluster or complex. Maybe they're just too exhausted. Maybe they're, somewhat depressed themselves or have had a difficult couple of weeks. That's why we come back and work in teams. So these principles I see, and I teach them to medical students, not as a constraint on medical practice, but because I want the students to be able to bring their whole self to the clinical encounter. Now, there are corollaries to that we should not kill. We are not supposed to engage in capital punishment, even when the authorities, it's court-ordered and it's legal in your jurisdiction. We are not supposed to engage in forcible interrogation or torture, even when the military or the civil authorities are asking us to do so. The reason to teach boundaries is, again, to enliven the clinical encounter. So as we start to close, let me say, to this point, we've been looking at the notion of meaning as if something to uncover, something to describe, much as Margaret Mead or a medical anthropologist would do so. But there is a different and a complementary approach. Maybe we can actively make meaning. Think about that term responsibility as a hyphenated responsibility. Beyond simply the obligations, the basic elements of care, we have the ability to bear witness. We can say to the other, we will bear witness to your pain and your sorrows, your disappointments and your triumphs. We will listen to the stories of your life, and we'll remember the story of your passing. This much we can do together in community as a commitment to one another, that your life and our relationship matters, that nothing, not even death, can take that from us. Doing so offers the potential of creating and strengthening relationships among individuals that are profoundly meaningful to the people involved. Anthropologists often suggest that stories play an important part of knitting together the fabric of the human community. Indeed, telling the story of a loved one's illness and dying, and receiving the story of another can both be creative acts. In telling personal stories of the life that is ending, people honor their loved ones who have died, and they renew and refresh and sometimes reframe cherished connections. In receiving a story as inherently intimate as that of the illness and dying of a lover, grandparent, parent, sibling, friend, or child, new connections can be made, and each person's community can expand. I am not the first to note that term community is actually more of a verb than a noun. It has the substance of a noun, but it's all about mutual responsiveness, mutual interactions, mutual connections. We had this demonstration project in Missoula, Montana for a number of years about the Missoula demonstration project to see what it was like to explore what it was like to live in community with one another rather than merely in proximity to one another around illness and caregiving and dying and grief. During a strategic planning session, we asked, what would success look like in this demonstration project if we really succeeded? And one of our board members, a guy named Kent Ellsworth, said, I know. He said, success would look like, in the future, a teenager stopping on his way home from high school to check on the frail elderly lady who lives next door, not because someone told him to do so, but because not checking on her wouldn't feel natural. Yeah, that's success. That's changing the culture when you grow up in a way that that's just part of what you do. You can't, it's not necessary to have a small community to do that. It's happening in New York City. This is the UJA's doula project, training people just like we train hospice volunteers, except not requiring people to be in hospice to get that training or to serve people. This is a retired lawyer who's sitting with a frail elder for his own sake, because that drive to caring brings him to do that rather than taking up some other, activity. Several years ago, I had the opportunity of spending a day at Oregon State Penitentiary up the street here. I wasn't there because I was told to go there, but I was glad to leave. I spent a day with 18 prison hospice volunteers, several of whom were convicted murderers. Each of these men had already been in prison 5 to 10 years, and each talked to me about having hit rock bottom several years ago, utter depression, during years of confinement, realizing they were never getting out. Each of them had little, what we would call dignity, very few rights. There is no material advantage to any of these inmates participating as hospice volunteers. They do so without any compensation, and they must maintain their regular 40-hour work week jobs. The training takes long hours and is emotionally charged. One after another, as we talked, they told unique stories that expressed that to them, being a hospice volunteer adds meaning and value to their lives. I felt like I was peering into the equivalent of J.B. Haldane's primordial soup that started the very cellular life that we have evolved from. In this instance, it was community, as in prison hospices across the country, that were coming together to recreate community for themselves, out of their own sense of enlightened self-interest, frankly, but also out of a drive to love, a drive of loving one another. It's a remarkable thing to witness. In my own now home state of New Hampshire, one of the examples that I think is vibrant is that of Phil Simmons. Phil was an English professor who had ALS and wrote a wonderful book called Learning to Fall. He was followed by All Things Considered for a full year before he died. And when he died, All Things Considered posted this on the NPR website with a quote that I wanted to read. Simmons said, "It takes a village to care for me." He said this of his caregiving group, which called itself FOPAC, for Friends of Phil and Catherine. He knew how lucky he was to have such friends, but he was firmly convinced that community support like this could flourish anywhere. He said, "To see a group like this working as well as it does, I would hope would cause people to reflect on the possibilities that there are in their own communities, because it can be done. Community is possible. Relationship is possible. It's up to us to create it." So that's what I wanted to tell you. When you think about what we can matter to one another. In fact, I mentioned love before, and love really is the most creative human response to the awe-inspiring and terrifying mystery of life. The loving connection between two people creates something new in the world, something that has inherent meaning for both involved. It's not easy, but what of value is easy? Rilke said in his letters to a young poet, "For one human being to love another human being, that is perhaps the most difficult task that has been entrusted to us, the ultimate test and proof, the work for which all other work is merely preparation." Indeed, the phrase tender, loving care is the sine qua non of excellence in care. It's one that we culturally resonate with. We can do this. There's nothing that I have found in the canons of medical ethics or medical or clinical practice and therapeutics that disallows genuine human love. There's nothing in ethics that prohibits that. Remember the three I mentioned? I can email them to you if you forget them. Right? No personal gain, no scamming, no sex, no killing. You get those down, and then you can relax and be free. We can respect people's inherent well-being. the capacity for well-being. We can respect people's inherent dignity. This is a photo of the 1948 UN Declaration of Human Rights, which begins with the preamble, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation for freedom, justice, and peace in the world. The inherent dignity. For all of us, certainly for me as a physician, but I think for all of us, the greater challenge is to care for people in their terminal decline, in their utter physical dependence, in a manner that allows them to see their inherent dignity reflected in our eyes, even when they're incontinent, even when they're out of sorts and maybe demented. We do not consider an infant or a toddler who is incontinent and utterly physically dependent to be undignified. They're just human. At the end of life, most of us will be dependent on others for the most basic of physical care. That doesn't make us undignified. It merely makes us human. Finally, we can make and create meaning sometimes through rituals. The reason that all religions have rituals is that there is something about it that is a deliberate way of making meaning. This is a traditional Montana funeral service, but it actually happened just a few years ago. It's coming back. Funerals and memorial services now are called celebrations of life, and they're actually coming back. They're, after years where we boomers poo-pooed them, they're actually now well attended, and we are recognizing that there's real value in them. They're changing in ways, but there's still a value. When Hervey DeRocher, I met Hervey when he was dying of cancer. I met him in the hospital. He was a successful businessman. Actually a fairly well-to-do accountant who retired at the age of 50 to return to family farming, his first love. When we met him, he knew there wasn't many treatment options left for his cancer, and he said to us, "I just want to get back on my tractor." We recognized that for Hervey, that was a metaphor for saying, "I want to get home." So we got him home. Working with his wife Joan and family in a wonderful hospice program in southern New Hampshire, we got him home. He lived for about another 3 weeks or so and then died gently. I got this memorial card in the mail from his wife Joan shortly after he died, and she said, "We should talk. I want to tell you the story of Hervey's last days." When I called her up, she explained his last days and how he died comfortably with his family around him. But then she talked about his memorial service, and she described the funeral procession from the church wending its way through the southern New Hampshire farm community countryside to graveside. And she said every family farm we passed had its tractors turned to the road, lights on, in silent memoriam for Hervey. That's community as a verb. And then there's Trinity, and Trinity was a 2-year-old, a 1-year-old that I cared for through the end of life. And her parents, Jake and Paige, have found this way to keep Trinity in their lives forever. It's a new way in our world of making sure that we know people matter to us and that they will always be part of our lives. So that's really what I came to say. The clinical professions, and certainly the professions of hospice and palliative care in particular, have leadership roles to play in helping society to grow the rest of the way up, to integrate the very fact of death in our lives into a full and healthy living. It can inform the way we live individually, as families, and as communities. We will not change the fact that we die, but we can recommit to care well for one another with utter competence and the best of scientific and clinical science, but also with utter unabashed tenderness and love, respecting people's inherent dignity and their capacity to grow even through these difficult times of life. That is our great, I think, historic challenge and our remarkable historic opportunity. Thank you for allowing me to come here and share these thoughts with you tonight. Thank you for inviting me on behalf of the Center. Thank you all.
If there's anyone in the overflow room who would like to come down and join us, there's a few seats down here now, so please do come down to, or up to the main hall if you'd like. We'll give Dr. Byock just a minute to have a sip of water, and if you'd like to ask a question, please come to one or the other of the microphones.
It's really nice to be here among you all. This is the part I've been looking forward to, is talking with you all. Hello. Could you just state your name and ask whatever you'd like?
My name is Connie.
Hi,
I
Connie.
must admit, this is a difficult topic, but death has never scared me. One of the things I do worry about, though, is that there are enormous numbers of us about to die or be in processes of dying, and we have extremely limited funds with which to deal with us. So while the idea of hospice and this wonderful care is very idealistic to me, the reality of our fiscal limits with so many people dying through the baby boomer generation, that's what I worry about, is that we're going to just sort of run out of the ability to care. And then there's millions and millions of people who are single in that generation as well. So that's some of my concerns.
It's my concerns too. We're not about to run out of money to care. But our health care dollars are being spent in absolutely the wrong ways, and the per capita spending on Americans certainly through the last 2 years of life is astronomical. You know, it's true that we can't sustain 17% of gross domestic product going to health care, and even if we could, we're not getting the return on our investment. I mean, we are not. You know, measurably, the healthcare system is not providing the outcomes that are worth investing in. So you're right. Something has to change, but we have to be cautious because we have a disease treatment system, not a healthcare system. And Big Med is doing very well. They're selling us hip replacements and knee replacements and you know, pacemakers and internal defibrillators, and you know, it seems like as long as they can bill us, there's always a product to provide, and the political system is not able to put limits on that because corporations are people, of course, as you know. And you know, they seem to have more than votes. They've got dollars to spend to turn public opinion and political opinion. So it's really a challenge. But there is actually more than enough money in the system now to take far better care of people. And there are examples of countries that do it better than others. Even within, you know, Oregon does it better than many states in the nation. But there are other states where you can look at pilot projects and small, wonderfully enlightened systems of care that we could bring to scale. So I don't think we're going to run out of money to do that, but the whole healthcare disease treatment dollars has to come down. There's plenty of money for hospice and palliative care. I mean, you only have to go north to Canada to see a system that takes a lot better care of people through the last 2 or 3 years of life than we do at half of the cost. But I think we're going to have a citizen consumer response to actually shift the way those dollars are being spent. I'll come to you, and then I'll come to you, John. Hi.
Hi.
Let me come to this. I think he beat you to the microphone. Go ahead.
Dr. Byock, I think we can all agree that the government has a right to intervene in the personal lives of adults who are either mentally incompetent or a criminal threat to society. Which of those two alternatives do you feel applies to those who seek medical help to achieve the final release from their own pain and suffering, or those doing it for them through living wills, when there's no chance of regaining quality of life, some sense of meaning and purpose and so on? Are they insane, or are they a criminal threat to society?
Oh, neither. I mean, I believe that there is rational suicide. But I think suicide and medical practice are two different things. There is no clearer statement than wanting to commit suicide or committing suicide that medical care has nothing left to offer. It is a clear decision to take yourself out of the medical care system. My problem partly with this and the way Oregon has structured it, and I'm not here to speak against the law. I'm a guest in your state. And I may disagree with the law, but I can count votes too, and you guys won. I mean, the proponents won. So So, you know, have cake. But I don't think it's a doctor's role. You see, understand, part of my reason is syncs with yours, that doctors are not purely personal and private. They are trained by society. They are licensed by society. They are board certified by society. They are paid by society. So, you know, suicide might be a purely personal and private act, but physician-assisted suicide is a social act. There's a physician who is trained, licensed, and paid in the room. And you don't need a physician to do this, actually. Not that I'm saying that physicians should abandon you. Remember, I think we are doing a terrible job of caring for people through the end of life. So we're probably in agreement about that. I just don't think suicide is part of what you should ask doctors and the medical profession, who have demonstrably been doing a terrible job doing the job that they own, to do this too. And as a proud, lifelong political progressive, I worry that we are currently not training doctors to do this, even at the best medical schools, even at OSHU. We are not paying the caregivers for people who are seriously ill well. We are half-staffing our nursing homes, but through, you know, about half, nursing homes are about half staffed with nurses' aides. And we're pauperizing, you know, we make paupers of people who are seriously ill and not dying quickly enough. And then we say, but don't worry, because we can write you a lethal prescription. I got to tell you, that doesn't seem like an extension of personal freedoms to me. It feels like a Sophie's choice. And I really, if you want to be progressive, let's talk about progressive politics and end-of-life care. Let's get together and put forward a law that says, a bill that says you have to double the amount of nurses' aides in nursing homes. That I'll get behind, right? If you really want somebody to feel dignified, you know, make sure there's enough staff to answer the bell when they need help in getting to the bathroom. That will help preserve their dignity. Let's ensure that every medical student has as much training in hospice and palliative medicine, required training, not an elective, required training in hospice and palliative medicine, that they now get in obstetrics and neonatal care, right? We're still 200 hours of medical curriculum is devoted to teaching doctors how to deliver prenatal care, delivering babies, and taking care of early, you know, neonates. Very few doctors in practice deliver babies anymore, and every single one who does has had a family practice residency or an OB/GYN residency. And, oh, by the way, the last time I checked, only about 50% of the population was really at risk for an obstetrical experience. But most doctors will be caring for people through the end of life. Not just hospice and palliative care doctors, but internists, family doctors, cardiologists, surgeons, critical care doctors, oncologists. We're not teaching them how to do it. So I think some radical changes will need to happen. And I got to tell you, I'm in hot water right now for saying these things at Dartmouth about obstetrics, for instance. I have obstetricians, academic obstetricians, who aren't talking to me at the moment. I mean that. We're going to need a citizen consumer movement to take this back. Something very akin to the birthing movement. When, you know, they didn't let, are you kidding? They didn't let fathers in delivery rooms when I was growing up. You know, we changed all that, but it's going to require us getting active. So I actually, you know, I don't think it's a doctor's role. Derek Humphrey, who lives near here, I wish he was here tonight. I haven't seen him in years. He's written, you know, a real bestseller about self-deliverance, and he will tell you on his website and you know, on the PBS special, if you haven't seen the Frontline special, The Suicide Plan, you ought to see it, how to self-deliver without a doctor's help. You know, okay. I just certainly, I still wouldn't be in favor of it, but I have to tell you, there's great danger in giving this authority to doctors when we can't do what we're supposed to do well at all. John.
Hi, Dr. Byock. Thank you very much for your talk tonight. I had a question about your sense of the doctor-patient relationship as it relates to family members and relatives, and wondered if you could share with us your thoughts on that. It seems that your position wouldn't preclude that from being a good doctor-patient relationship.
I'm not sure what the that is in that sentence, John.
So when you have construed the three different kind of prohibitions, I understand you to be saying personal gain sort of more connected to financial gain in a certain serious way. And then your emphasis on love, it seems, is pretty critical. And wouldn't it be on your position then acceptable morally for a provider or a physician to be caring for their loved one or their family member or their relative in a way that right now currently in our society that's taboo. That's not the
so
right
for a physician to
relationship.
care for one's own family members. Yeah, I don't think that's a major transgression, to tell you the truth.
Okay.
I think, while it's not a good guideline and the old saw, the legal saw, only a fool has himself as an attorney, or I butchered that. I think that a little of that applies to medicine, but if you're a family physician and your child has pink eye, very few people wait in at an emergency department. Very few of my colleagues wait in an emergency department to get some polysporin for their kid's eye. You're right, call in a prescription, and I don't see that as a particular ethical transgression. Yes, sir. Hi.
Please feel free to say this is too big a subject for tonight.
What is your name?
Gerald.
Hi, Gerald.
Thank you. Would you care to speak on women's rights, Planned Parenthood, and abortion? And you can say no.
Well, I consider myself a strong proponent of women's rights. I think the issue of abortion is really convoluted, and I would love to have that conversation over a glass of wine, but I think it really is confusing to try to keep creating analogies between the abortion debate and the end of life debate or the assisted suicide debate. I've never found it to be particularly helpful, and when you do go through it, it takes hours to go through. But I am a proud political progressive, and I really, I've rarely voted Republican. I'm kind of I usually think the Democrats are far too right. I'm pretty left of most Democrats. I'm sort of a Bernie Sanders progressive, if you know Bernie Sanders from Vermont. So you can guess how I vote on these things. Yeah, hi.
Yeah, my name is Marcy, and I've been through 3 hospice situations within my immediate family, probably in 15 years. The first 2 were cancer situations in which the doctor told us, this needs to be a hospice situation. The third one was my stepmom, who had Alzheimer's, and I was actually the one to ask for care in that case. It struck me that that wasn't a discussion they had with us long before. And I was just wondering your feelings on that.
It's unbelievable. It's a national disgrace. If I find it hard to explain Medicare eligibility criteria for Alzheimer's patients to families. It feels so embarrassing, because if you don't know it, in order to qualify for hospice for dementia, you have to have the functional capacity of an invertebrate. I mean, if you can string more than 6 words together, you don't qualify. You have to be utterly dependent, nonverbal, and have such advanced dementia that the person is beyond any counseling or support. So here's a place where citizen consumer pressure has to change the Medicare benefit. It makes no sense. We're actually, by withholding hospice care from families, patients and families with Alzheimer's or other progressive dementias, we're actually causing worse quality at higher costs. And it's not a principle of therapeutics or principle of medical ethics that's stopping us from doing it. It is Congress. It is language in a statute. It will literally take an act of Congress to fix that. And what I wonder about is, where is the groundswell to fix that? Because there's so much suffering that we could touch if we could see that patient early in the diagnosis, and then maybe at intervals as the disease progresses and there were choice points or critical issues of care, where they're going to live, how they were going to be cared for, what their choices were for further treatment, that needed to be addressed. So you've brought a poignant example, and I'm sorry for it, but it is, I can't explain it away. It's a national disgrace.
Is that being talked about in academic?
Hardly, no.
Okay.
We're spending our time debating assisted suicide in most states instead of talking about it. Really and truly. That's part of why what makes me an opponent is that the debate itself has distracted us from actually actionable changes that could fix suffering, that could actually ensure that doctors don't get trained and don't get licenses until they can prove that they can communicate with people, that they know what an advance directive is, that they can assess people's pain, that they know how to treat people's, basically at least treat people's pain, and on and on. Staff nursing homes and like, we're not having this discussion as a generation or as a body politic. We're captured by talking about assisted suicide, which seems to me to be not the strategically most effective place to put our collective energies. Yes.
My name is Nanette, and I'm a hospice director, very proudly.
Thanks for being here.
And I have actually two questions.
Sure.
One is, why do you think that language is not taught to physicians in medical schools? Why is that? Why does that seem to be something that either they're resistant to or that no emphasis is being put behind to help them have those hard discussions with families?
So let me answer that quickly. So part of it is psychological and sort of the, what I talked about, philosophical, that we don't like to talk about illness, dying, death, grief. But it's also driven, the history of it has been that, medicine became more sophisticated through the scientific method and the treatment of injury and disease and fighting to save life. And that's where the cultural currency within the medical community is, and that's where the physical, the real currency of dollars are. That's what gets paid, and so that's what we teach. It's not right, but I think that the technological imperative is driving a lot of the curriculum. And it seems like the soft stuff, talking about communications, eyes roll in academic centers. I think another thing, by the way, and this gets back to the women's issue, I think some of this stuff is women's work. It has been diminished because it's considered, hygiene, keep cleanliness, helping with feeding and all that, communication, continuity. That's the stuff that the social workers and the nurses and the care coordinators do. And I really think that's part of the psychology that keeps it suppressed. I'm hoping it's going to change, but.
The second question that I have, I will tell you that I respectfully disagree with your position on assisted death. However, one thing that I would tell you is, and would ask of you, is I think that there are, that it's particularly people who are in hospice and palliative care know that people suffer in different ways. And there are different types of suffering. And I would be interested in knowing how you engage in this discussion with fellow physicians who don't have your same opinion. What have they brought to you as a consideration for that? I'd be interested to know what kind of dialogue have you engaged in with that?
A whole range of dialogue. I mean, I have lots of people who disagree with me. A majority of the people in the state disagree with me. No, I mean, I live in a reality-based world. I mean, I know that. I worry about it a lot. I worry about where it's going, and I want to ask you, what do you do with the people who say, well, how are you different than Kevorkian? I thought you could only do that in Oregon, is what they say to me. But I think there's real worries about conflating what you do in hospice care with hastening death. And it's keeping some people from even calling your number or knocking on your door. They worry. I worry about this. I also worry about where it's going. People used to say, well, the slippery slope is just in your head, Dr. Byock. It's never going to happen. Look at Oregon. Well, okay, but anybody here who disagrees with me, please watch the Frontline series on the suicide plan, because it's very clear where this is going is not death, assisted dying with restrictions. It's assisted dying because you want it. No illness required. That's where it's going. Well, watch that program. In Belgium, which has been one of the forerunners here, in December, two brothers were given euthanasia at their request, and it was decided it was their right, who were not ill except that they were going blind. That's where it's going. So this is not an allegation. This is my understanding of a 1-hour program that I just watched on PBS. And Barbara Coombs-Lee supported it. She's part of the Final Exit Network. Derek Humphrey watched the PBS special. Derek Humphrey is on the website talking about helium hoods. With you don't have to go through any of this. I think this doesn't feel wholesome to me. But again, I'm not actually politically active in this. I write the occasional op-ed, but I just think as a physician and as an educator, it's not. We need to create a firewall between what we do. In hospice and palliative care, one of the founding principles of our discipline is that we do not hasten death. So that's a really tough one for me to meld. I respect your political, personal political viewpoints, and I wouldn't even ask you how you vote in a voting booth, but I think it's not healthy for hospice clinicians to be participating in any way in hastening death.
I totally agree. I think it's the dignity issue where oftentimes patients have some sort of disease process that is going to make their leaving so undignified and so difficult for them, and it's their personal dignity that they suffer with. And that was what I was alluding.
Personal dignity happens in a social context. How are you feeling about the staffing in nursing homes?
Oh, I hate it.
Do some people feel undignified because they end up wet because they can't get to the bathroom?
Absolutely.
Without help?
Absolutely.
So we have a social issue here that we agree on. This is unconscionable. And that I want to join you with. Anybody who disagrees with me, I will write letters with you. I will come and lend my name to those bills. Thank you. Yes, hi.
Hi. I'm Teresa.
Hi, Teresa.
And this is a difficult question for me to articulate, but you talked tonight about how physicians are trained to be disease warriors rather than healthcare providers, and that our government is also geared in that way, and the whole medical economic system is geared in that way. So here sits this generation, this large generation on the cusp of this, entering this phase of life. And I guess I'm thinking that it's going to take a long time for that kind of culture and that kind of change to happen. And then that calls, to my mind, the question of then, what are our responsibilities as these adults entering this phase of life? What kind of choices do we need to be looking at personally? Because what I see, too, in terms of talking about a loss of dignity, is that people enter into an illness and then rather than looking at quality of life, their life is prolonged to a point where they don't have any dignity left.
And why has that happened?
I think partially because there's a lack of training in terms of collaboration between patient and physician, and not clear choices offered, and that people don't really realize it's okay to not do every last thing that is offered.
I tend to agree with you.
And so I'm wondering then, where, with that in mind, as intelligent human beings, where are our responsibilities in thinking about
So one
that?
has to advocate strongly because the healthcare system is broken. Doctors are not well trained to do this phase of work. They're not trained to do the clear decision-making, communication, all that guidance. And so we have to be savvy among ourselves. We have to be savvy consumers and citizen and advocates for one another. Part of the reason that I write books is because I kind of explain in those books, like the best care. I'm not trying to sell it, but the best care possible, how people can make informed decisions that truly use all of medical power to treat disease as long as life is worth living, and also help craft a personalized plan for how to be cared for so that they can die gently with their dignity intact. But that doesn't involve always dying with your boots or your makeup on. You know, it does acknowledge that we will be cared for because as part of the human community, that's what we do. And I know people disagree with that, but you know, we could go a long, long way for people to die really much better and be cared for much better, and for most people to feel that their dignity was preserved without being overtreated. Some of what happens now, as you described it, let's face it, is bad care. If we could diminish some of the bad care where decisions aren't well made, where it's assumed that people want to have a tube in their throat and have CPR and be in the ICU, we would go a long way to improving the last chapter of people's lives. So we have to get active. I mean, there's, how big is the palliative care program in your local hospital? You know, how is it staffed? You know, how can they have a 400-bed hospital with X number of staff? You know, you have to ask tough citizen consumer questions. Mm-hmm. Again, I lived through this. We changed the way pregnancy and childbirth were managed in 2 decades. Completely transformed it. It's entirely different than it used to be. I was born under general anesthesia. You know, it was a medical event. That's, you know, fathers weren't allowed in delivery rooms. We were worried they'd fall over. The medical profession pushed back on it. And citizen consumers pushed through it. And now doctors and hospitals embrace it, and the results of prepared childbirth are better than unprepared childbirth for the woman, the infant, the father, the family, all involved. A very similar citizen consumer response needs to happen. I really, what drives me crazy is people say, but the doctors just won't listen. Since when are we giving doctors that much power? I'm a physician. The bus has left the station. We should tell the doctors, you want to get on the bus, get on the bus. You don't want to get on the bus, we're leaving anyway. You know, we have to take care of one another. If the medical profession needs a kick in the tush to get moving, you know, they got to do it. I'm sorry, but that's the way I feel.
Thank you.
Thank you. Oh, we should only take a couple more.
Okay.
I'll take.
My name is Ann, and
hi.
And I would like to recommend the film available on Netflix on how to die in Oregon, that will diffuse some of the misconceptions that have been implied tonight. The people of Oregon have spoken, as you want people to do, for their legislatures. We have spoken. The law has been in existence since 1994. It has an exemplary record.
So
it is not going down some slippery slope. I know, I'm a volunteer. I have helped people through this process, which is very, very, very strict, and it's not easy. And I have helped a client who made her personal choice. I want a personal choice and a decision of when my passing will happen and how. I don't want to be kept alive with medications that will keep me in a dopey state. I want to be conscious. I want to be aware. And I've helped a woman who made this personal choice. Her last words to me were, "Thank you, you're hastening the inevitable." These people are dying. They are dying already. It's not like there's some force that's keeping them alive when they've been diagnosed with a terminal illness. So they have a right, in my mind, to decide how and when they will pass, and that's what Compassion in Oregon does. Compassionate Choices of Oregon does.
Thank you for your comment.
So.
Yes.
Hi, I'm Michaela.
Hi, Michaela.
And you mentioned multiple things about the problems in our healthcare system being part of caused by the fact that we don't like to talk about death. And I was curious if there was anything being done in education from a cross-cultural perspective, because I know that our culture has, very big issues with death, but very many other cultures don't, and there are many cultures that view death and dying and taking care of the elderly in many different ways. And I was curious if people have ever considered trying to teach from a cross-cultural perspective and introduce our doctors to these ideas that other people have, if that's ever been done.
Great comment. It gets talked about occasionally, but basically except for a few courses here or there, it's not being done. But I tend to agree. We have a lot to learn from other cultures, including some sort of less developed cultures who care for their loved ones and seriously ill and dying people in ways that I would consider to be better than we're doing today. So your point is very well taken. Thank you. Can we take two more? One here and one there?
Hi.
Yes, hi.
My name's Christina. I had the unfortunate event of recently dealing with my great-grandfather's death. He had Alzheimer's. He was taken to several different care facilities, and one in particular stuck in my mind. The general feel of the facility was very depressing. I went in there. There were people everywhere. It seemed like they were lost. They didn't have any purpose. They were just there waiting to die. And the staff didn't really seem to be able to enliven the environment in any way to help facilitate a better ending for them. And I was wondering if you had any suggestions as to improvements to those care facilities.
Yeah, we almost have to just tear them down and start from scratch again. There are examples of places that are light and lively where child care and elder care happen, where there are dogs and animals and enough staff to actually not just meet people's needs, but engage them and pamper them. I've rarely met somebody, even in advanced dementia, that you couldn't make more calm or even bring smiles to their faces by actively pampering them. This sounds outrageous, by the way, because we've lived now generations where our nursing homes are so, not all of them, there are exceptions, of course, but many nursing homes are so woefully bad that we cringe at going into them, that we think, we recoil at the thought of being in them ourselves or sending a loved one there. Let me say, there are utter examples of a complete opposite, where people are not just cared for, but honored and celebrated and pampered during their frailty. And that really reframes this notion of dignity, by the way. But I know they're rare, and this probably sounds woo-woo, but they exist, and notice that that this seems unusual, but I'll assert it's possible. We just, as a culture, haven't gone there. Instead, we pay for ICU care instead of paying for enlightened Eden alternative type of care. Thank you for your comment. I'm sorry for your great-grandfather's loss.
Thank you.
Sir.
Hi, my name is Pete. Thank you, doctor.
Thank you, Pete.
I'll make this real short.
Sure.
If a doctor is attending a patient who has terrible, terrible pain, and the only way to alleviate that pain is for the doctor to give a very strong medicine, but the doctor knows this medicine will eventually cause organ failure and death, but the patient wants it, is that doctor-assisted suicide?
Let me just change the premise a little bit. So I frequently will give, every once a week at least, give people medications that are necessary to control their discomfort and allow them to die gently, where the cost of their comfort is diminished responsiveness or diminished sensorium. And it doesn't exactly cause organ failure. I fully believe, or as I understand it, they are dying of their disease. They're simply not dying in distress. So it happens frequently. It is certainly, it is a bright line between that and ending a person's life. If I wanted to end their life, I could do so with massive doses that stop their breathing, or using potassium chloride to stop their heart. That's, chemically, that's the way we do, or using, helium or whatever. But we are titrating. We are giving doses of medicine necessary to control suffering, and we do not consider that to be hastening death.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, take us home.
From the other culture.
Hi.
So I'm from Nepal, and
what is your name?
Anjani.
Anjani,
so
nice to meet you.
This is my second term here at U of O. So it was great lecture. I really enjoyed it.
I'm so glad you said that. I'm not sure I'm feeling the love.
Thank you very much. And death back in my country is like normal. Everyone dies, and but the different thing is back in my country we don't have like the kids living away from the parents. Mm-hmm. Like for example, I have a grandmother who is 96 years old now, and she lives with my parents, and my brother lives with my parents, and it's only me who's here, but I talk to them on Skype every day. So, I mean, then, you know, my grandmother doesn't have any problem when I talk to her about the death. She's like, well, it's normal, you know, and of course she has that feeling that, okay, my son is there to take care of me, and then my parents have the same feeling because my brother is there. So, so my question is, since you have seen like so many people dying, and of course they have taught you a lot of things, you know, during the phase they're dying, and of course I can see that it has made you a very compassionate person. And if you are to give an advice, not as a physician, but as a person when you were during that phase, if you are to give an advice to the people who are living, what would that advice be?
If you're worried about what will happen years from now when you're facing your own death, my best piece of advice is get yourself a family.
Okay.
If you're lucky enough to have a family, invest in it.
Mm-hmm.
This is a good time to say those 4 things and to make amends and to strengthen relationships, because families care for one another, just as you've well described. In a family, your well-being matters to me. I'm not entirely well if you're not well. So, you know, in fact, you're right that our American tendency to live alone, and we've conflated sort of Jeffersonian democracy ideals, which work well in the body politic, with our social well-being, where we are connected. We don't work well. Things don't go well individually. If if you're worried, if you don't have a family, you really, you know, I'm not against you, a person, being adopted or adopting another person or getting married, but I'm not suggesting that. But if you can't get a family, get a community. Whether it's a faith community or a service group or the 4-H or something that you're really connected to, because again, in communities we tend to care for one another, and you're less likely to find yourself unbefriended when your time comes to need help. Thank you very much for your comment. Thank you all very, very much for being here.